Melissa Carter stood in the long line outside the local food bank, the weight of the week pressing down on her. Her 7-year-old daughter, Emma, clung to her hand, while her 4-year-old son, Ben, tugged impatiently at her coat. It was their third visit this month, and as much as Melissa appreciated the help, the experience always left her drained. The lines were getting longer, the shelves emptier, and Melissa often found herself walking away with less than her family needed to get through the week. Today felt no different. By the time Melissa reached the front of the line, many of the items she'd hoped for were already gone. The cereal boxes, snack bars, and fresh produce had been picked clean, leaving behind a few dented cans of green beans and a bag of rice. Melissa's heart sank as she gathered what she could, trying to mask her disappointment for the sake of her kids. Later that evening, as the children played quietly in their shared bedroom, Melissa scrolled through social media to distract herself from the gnawing worry about how she would make the food last. That's when she saw it, a photo posted by a group of local college students, their faces smiling above piles of groceries, captioned, "Stocking up for the week, thanks food bank." Melissa's stomach churned. The students were surrounded by stacks of bread, fresh fruit, and milk. Exactly the kinds of items her kids had asked for earlier. She stared at the photo, her emotions swinging between anger and disbelief. These students didn't have children to feed, she thought. Why would they take so much, knowing others in the community were struggling too? The frustration that had been simmering for weeks boiled over. She thought back to the times she'd stood in line for hours, only to watch as shelves emptied before her turn. The memory of Emma asking for an apple that Melissa didn't have pierced her heart. "They're taking more than they need," Melissa muttered to herself, her fists clenching around her phone. That night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, Melissa's mind raced. She felt powerless against the system that left families like hers scrambling for scraps. But seeing the students' post ignited something else in her, a need to speak up, to demand fairness, to protect her children from a world that always seemed to give them the short end of the stick. She didn't know how yet, but Melissa was determined to do something. This wasn't just about groceries anymore, it was about survival and justice for her family. Melissa couldn't get the image out of her mind. The smiling faces, the abundance of food. It felt like a mockery of her own struggle. She saw her kids' faces in the reflection of her phone screen and felt her frustration deepen. It wasn't fair. She spent hours in line, hoping to get enough to feed her family, only to come home with a bag of mismatched canned goods. Meanwhile, these students who had no children to care for were taking the very items her kids needed most. The next morning, as she packed sandwiches for Emma and Ben, Melissa's anger began to turn into determination. She had to say something. She couldn't sit by while families like hers went without, especially when others were taking more than they needed. Confrontation at the food bank. On her next visit to the food bank, Melissa's eyes scanned the line for familiar faces. Sure enough, a group of young Indian students stood near the front, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. She recognized one of them from the social media post, a tall young man with dark hair and a shy smile. As the students moved through the line, Melissa noticed how quickly their bags filled with fresh produce, bread, and cartons of milk. She gritted her teeth, watching the shelves empty before her turn. By the time she reached the front, most of the good items were gone again. Melissa couldn't hold it in any longer. She marched over to the young man as he stood outside, chatting with his friends. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice shaking with both anger and nerves. The group turned to look at her, their smiles fading. "Do you really need all that food?" she demanded, gesturing to their bulging bags. "Some of us have kids at home who are going hungry while you're stocking up for yourselves." The young man, startled, stepped forward. "We're not trying to take too much," he said earnestly. "There are 5 of us living together. We share everything." Melissa's face hardened. "You don't have kids to feed," she said sharply. "You don't understand what it's like to have little mouths asking for food you don't have." The young man, who introduced himself as Rajesh, opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. His friends glanced at each other awkwardly before murmuring a quiet goodbye and walking away. Melissa felt a twinge of guilt watching them leave, but her anger drowned it out. They didn't understand her life, and she didn't have time to worry about theirs. Divided opinions. Word of the confrontation spread quickly among the food bank community. Some parents sympathized with Melissa, agreeing that families with children should take priority. "It's not fair," one mother said. "We're barely getting by, and they're taking enough for an army." But others defended the students. "They're struggling too," a volunteer countered. "They're far from home, with no family to support them. Why shouldn't they use the food bank if they need it?" The divide left Melissa feeling even more isolated. She had expected solidarity, but instead, it felt like people were turning the issue into a debate about who deserved help the most. At work, Melissa vented to Lena, who listened patiently. "I get why you're upset," Lena said carefully. "But maybe there's more to their story. Just because they don't have kids doesn't mean they're not struggling." Melissa crossed her arms. "Struggling? They don't know what struggling is until they've had to skip meals so their kids can eat." A chance to understand. A few days later, Melissa was surprised to see Rajesh waiting near the food bank entrance. He seemed hesitant, clutching a small bag of groceries. When he spotted Melissa, he approached her cautiously. "Hi," he said, his voice soft. "I wanted to say I'm sorry if we took more than we should have. We didn't mean to upset anyone." Melissa blinked, caught off guard by his sincerity. "It's not about you," she said stiffly. "It's about the system. Families like mine are always the ones left with nothing." Rajesh nodded. "I understand, but we're not trying to take from anyone. We're just trying to survive too." He went on to explain his situation. As an international student, Rajesh was allowed to work only a few hours a week due to visa restrictions. He and his roommates pooled their money and resources to get by, often relying on the food bank for essentials. "We're not trying to be greedy," Rajesh said. "It's just that we don't have many options, and we share everything we take." For the first time, Melissa saw a flicker of her own struggles in his story. She thought about her long days at work, her constant worry about making ends meet, and how hard it was to explain to her kids why they couldn't have what other children did. Maybe Rajesh and his friends weren't so different after all. A new perspective. At home that evening, Melissa replayed the conversation in her head. She felt conflicted. Her anger had been justified, but had it been directed at the wrong people? Rajesh wasn't the enemy. He was just another person trying to get by in a world that often felt stacked against them. The real issue, she realized, wasn't the students or the families. It was the system itself. A system that left so many people scrambling for resources that should have been abundant. Melissa decided it was time to act. Instead of letting her frustration fester, she reached out to the food bank coordinator, proposing changes to ensure families with children had better access to essential items. Advocating for change. At the next community meeting, Melissa stood up to speak. "I know we're all here because we're struggling," she began, her voice steady. "But we need to find a way to make this work for everyone. Families with kids shouldn't have to fight for the basics, and neither should students or anyone else." She proposed creating separate distribution times for families and students, ensuring that each group had access to what they needed. Rajesh, who had also attended the meeting, stood up to share his own perspective, explaining the challenges faced by international students. The discussion was tense at first, but as more people shared their stories, the room began to shift. By the end of the meeting, the group agreed to pilot Melissa's idea and explore other ways to expand the food bank's resources. Orst. Building bridges. Melissa and Rajesh began working together to organize the new distribution system. They also spearheaded a food drive, enlisting local businesses to donate more items. Slowly, the atmosphere at the food bank began to change. Melissa's kids, Emma and Ben, even joined in, helping pack bags and chatting with the students who had once seemed like competitors. Rajesh taught Emma how to fold paper cranes during a lull in the packing, earning a delighted laugh from the little girl. Watching her kids play with Rajesh and his friends, Melissa felt a wave of hope. The tension that had once defined her visits to the food bank was fading, replaced by a sense of community and collaboration. Months after her confrontation with Rajesh, Melissa stood outside the food bank on a chilly morning, helping organize the newly implemented distribution system. Families with children were scheduled for the first hour, followed by students and individuals without dependents. The new approach had reduced the tension Melissa had felt so strongly during her earlier visits. And for the first time, the food bank felt less like a battlefield and more like a place of support. As Melissa handed a bag of groceries to a mother with a toddler on her hip, she caught sight of Rajesh helping an elderly man navigate the aisles. Their eyes met, and he gave her a small wave. She waved back, smiling. The animosity that had once defined their relationship was gone, replaced by a quiet camaraderie born from shared understanding and collaboration. Forging new connections. Later that afternoon, Melissa sat with Rajesh at a folding table in the corner of the food bank, organizing items for a community meal they had planned together. The event, Neighbors Helping Neighbors, was an idea they had brainstormed during one of their many conversations. The goal was simple: bring people together to share a meal and break down the barriers that had divided them. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this," Melissa said, stacking cans of soup into neat rows. Rajesh laughed softly. "Me neither, but it feels good, doesn't it?" Melissa nodded, her gaze falling on Emma and Ben, who were running around with a group of students. Rajesh had become a fixture in her kids' lives, often helping Emma with math homework or teaching Ben how to play card games. It was a friendship Melissa hadn't anticipated, but had grown to deeply appreciate. A moment of reflection. As the community meal began, Melissa sat quietly at one of the long tables, watching the room fill with laughter and conversation. Families and students who had once eyed each other with suspicion were now sharing plates of food and trading stories. The transformation was subtle but profound. Maria, the food bank coordinator, sat down beside her. "You've done a lot for this place," she said, "for the community." Melissa shook her head. "I didn't do it alone. Rajesh and so many others helped. I guess I realized we're all fighting the same battles in different ways." Maria smiled. "That's the hard part, seeing past our own struggles to understand someone else's." A new chapter. As Melissa helped clean up at the end of the night, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but something fundamental had shifted. The food bank was no longer just a place of scarcity. It was a community, one built on empathy, understanding, and shared effort. As she walked home with Emma and Ben, Melissa looked up at the night sky and felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope.